Well, hello everyone. My name is Michele Smith, and I want to thank you so much for joining me for a trauma practitioner's perspective. I'm actually hopeful to address a few things, maybe three topics that are of concern for so many people in our current culture. Certainly, they're of a big concern to me, and that's sex education and transgender ideology in schools and the effects on community and the MAID situation. And I'm hopeful to present some information from my perspective that may not have been considered, or maybe it has. But firstly, I'm going to start with fact because I'm wanting you to sort of keep this on the back burner while we carry on or proceed. So firstly, on the subject of gender dysphoria, gender ideology and sex education in schools, I'd like to start by saying that the the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe part of the brain, that is the part of the brain that reasons, it problem solves, it contemplates, it determines long-term consequences and reward. It's responsible for decision making, impulse control, discernment, and just a whole lot more. It's where we solve our problems. It's where we philosophize. It's where all those higher cognitive functions take place. So the higher executive functions. It's also where our empathy lies as well. So some say it's where our humanness is. That part of the brain does not fully mature until the average age of 25. Usually about 23 for girls, maybe 26 for young men, but average age of 25, that is not fully developed. So in light of that fact, it seems in my view that the term mature minor is more than a small contradiction in terms. Quite frankly, it doesn't really matter how mature we may feel a child or a teen is. Their brains, with all of those executive reasoning and decision-making skills, is not fully developed until they are roughly 25 years old. You cannot access something you don't have. So let's start with that. And I'm going to ask you to just kind of keep that piece of information on the back burner for a moment. I started with this fact because I'm going to refer to it again. I'm going to set it aside and I'm going to take a closer look at what potentially or the potential of happening within families when an outside person or group wedges themselves between parents and children. I don't think there's a parent that hasn't had the experience of someone or a group influencing their children in ways that are encouraging that child to defy or emotionally reject parents. I mean, every parent has had that experience. But if this happens in a court of law, when there's a custody battle or a divorce proceedings where children's visitation is an issue, it's called parental alienation. And it's deeply frowned upon and can even cost the alienating parent their children. So parental alienation is a strategy whereby one parent intentionally displays to the child unjustified negativity aimed at the other parent. The purpose of the strategy is to damage the child's relationship with the other parent and turn the child's emotions against that other parent. I've seen that same tactic used by one teen towards another. Cults use it all the time, and even adults in certain situations. This can cause trauma in the child, in the parents, and in other family members as well. So the emotional disruptions in the home can be long-term and the damage extensive. And it's a result of having an uninvited guest in your home standing between you and your child. This is often followed by love bombing of the targeted child with confirmations of bravery, declarations of who really loves them, who's really looking out for their best interest, and who would be happy to step up to the plate and be their family. This usually lasts until the child transitions or the desired result is reached. And then they find themselves trying to fit into a culture or environment that is largely foreign to them and that they had not considered, and usually find themselves alone trying to cope with that. I know that we want to believe that this type of alienation started with the transgender community and their influence in schools, but unfortunately it started long before that. So it started in my view anyway, and it's my perspective you're getting, with the introducing of sex education in schools. That's a subject matter that has been traditionally a family or parental responsibility. Now, I was told by educators at the time that it was an attempt to educate so they could help with teenage pregnancy. All sounded good at the time. Well, that soon escalated to condoms in the washroom, and you can visit the nurse and get the pill, and you don't have to tell your parents. The reason you don't have to tell your parents is because they may not approve. And if we have a degree in teaching science, history, or math, that qualifies us as the expert who knows what's best for you. A little bit more on that one later. But teaching children to lie, keep secrets, defy their parents, alienating kids from their parents. Graphic age inappropriate material can now be found in schools, public libraries, sexualizing our children at very early ages. I asked several teachers about teaching morality with sex education, and I got the same response every single time. It's not our job to teach morality. Well, when you're supplying graphic images, sexual images and information without context, without moral context, in my view, it becomes nothing more than a how-to manual, causing an explosion in sexual promiscuity, even among the very young. So we then accepted that our kids were going to have sex, and we rushed out, to put them on the pill to prevent them from suffering any consequences from this normal behavior. So what are we missing all this? Firstly, and again, the cognitive part of kids' brains do not fully develop until they are 25, which makes them highly suggestible and vulnerable to what they're learning. Early sexualization of our children has devastating effects, and that is well documented. Look, you can't give up years and years of psychological research by the masters in favor of an ideology. That's ridiculous. So there is clearly a strong connection between the increase in sexual imagery and the presentation of stereotyped images of young women. So, for example, both, as to their appearance and their social roles, and the growing incident of eating and other disorders related to body image and earlier participation in sexual activity as well. So early sexual activity or exposure can, result in self-harm behaviors or unnecessary risk-taking. There's solid evidence for the link between early sexualization, mental health issues, and trauma. Promiscuity is not the only outcome of early sexualization of children either. So one is also seeing a societal backlash and fear of children deviating from morally proper behavior. So with boys who have constant access to pornographic material, having pornographic expectations from relationships. Okay, the girls, the role also on pornographic expectation on the role of girls or women, and also often a very distorted view of their own sexuality and sex drive. For girls, the impact is even more severe. Their self-esteem is drastically lowered when they feel validated only by expressing themselves through sexualized means. The mixture of these two increasingly under-informed and confused groups often result in devastating interactions. The constant and open viewing of graphic sexual material is blurring the lines between child pornography and what is alleged education. And that's leaving our young vulnerable to predators, traffickers, and pedophiles. As this follows them into adulthood, where they often base relationships on early sexual activity, frequently moving in with the other after knowing them for weeks and depriving them of the important experience of forming solid relationships or even knowing what that is. Demoralizing, it's dehumanizing, and yet so many in government and education system have fought for the right to do so. They seem to have forgotten whose children these are. So gender pronouns, far too many to count. and alternate identities are a popular thing at the moment. So I recently explained to a school counselor that by accommodating alternate identities, she's encouraging dissociative behaviors. So we have had a name for it for years. It's called dissociative identity disorder. Gender pronouns like they, it, he, she, and so on are not affirming kids' identities. They're depriving them of identities. So causing, and it's causing depersonalization and derealization and a real definite rift between reality and unreality, truth and lies. So when dissociation happens as a child to avoid adverse life events that are overwhelming, it may be a good coping strategy at that time. But as it follows them into adulthood, it doesn't work so well for them anymore. When we are faced with a generation of young adults who may be suicidal, whose mental health is out of control, and they are in desperate condition, most of those who initiated this will have forgotten what they did to cause it, or at least refuse to take responsibility for it. But don't worry, I'm sure the drama teacher knows best what's for your children, far better than what you do. Gender dysphoria in our young has been declared a symptom of a transgender, but in my textbooks, it's listed as a symptom of trauma. And so as teens are trying to find their own identity, deciding what they're going to keep that mom and dad taught them, and what they're going to put on the back burner, so they can now transition to an adult relationship with parents. This is a process that should not be interrupted. This is a normal process. A high percentage of children suffering from gender dysphoria find that once they're through puberty, this has resolved itself. Educators have told me that prior to COVID, they may have found maybe one transgender in a school. During and after COVID, it was at least one per classroom. That ought to tell you something, because COVID was a threat either to one's own safety or the safety of a loved one, and that is the very basis of traumatic experience. With the previous points kind of made and out of the way on early sexualization of our children and its effects of gender dysphoria, parental alienation, and the glaring fact that the reasoning part of the brain does not develop until the rough age of 25, I have to personally believe that this is not a progressive, nor is it particularly life-giving or healthy. It's predatory. I truly believe, that all sex education should be taken out of schools, all of it. All of it. It is a parental responsibility, and left in the hands of those that are teaching it out of any sort of moral content is creating a mess, in my view. Teaching children to lie, keep secrets, defy parents, alienating kids from parents, sexualizing them, is that really what we thought education was about? School children being encouraged to take puberty blockers or have their breasts removed before their brains are fully developed and they can make a cognitive decision on their own and be fully accountable for their own choices. Do we believe that children will grow up and actually thank us profusely for this? Or are they going to mature and realize what's been stolen from them? Parents, we used to be so much better than this. We were so much stronger than this. There was a time we never would have permitted such a thing. I know we've all been boiled like frogs, but the evidence of damage is now so glaring that if we do nothing, we're condoning this. These are our children. It doesn't end there in terms of fallout either. What effects is this having on many of our teachers? You'd be surprised how many actually agree with what I'm saying, but have zero choice in whether they teach this or not. They don't write the curriculums, by the way. They could be fired for refusing. What is the result and effect on communities? Well, when you have the education system or anyone else for that matter standing between children and parents, you create the first cracks in communities. I mean, suddenly the inability to communicate for the needs of your children is there. Parents and teachers are now at odds. Teachers and boards are wearing, parents angered, absolutely full on. Parents are traumatized by the victimization of their children at the hands of educators. I've spoken to educators that truly believe that they should be given the legal right to raise your children, and I have spoken to those that are horrified by what's happening. This then leaks into areas of community like trying to speak to government representative who has already sanctioned and support what's happening in the education system. We can often find ourselves at odds with neighbors and family members. Our communities start to crumble with division. In order for our communities to start breaking down, first, the family unit has to break down. Family is the very foundation of community, and connection is essential for healing trauma. So on that note, I'm going to give a very brief breakdown on what trauma is essentially, and I'm going to use some visuals here to explain it. There we go. Okay. So what is trauma? Now, I'm only scratching the surface here, you guys, so please bear with me. So a traumatic event is a life experience that involves actual or perceived threats to one's own safety or the safety of a loved one. And it's usually categorized by feelings of helplessness and terror being the operative word, with the individual unable to make sense or come to terms with the event. So the circumstance commonly includes, abuse of power, betrayal of trust, entrapment, pain, confusion, helplessness, and/or loss. And this can lead to the traumatic experience actually becoming stuck in the body's nervous system and emotional brain, and it's unable to complete its cycle. And so it's holding its victim in a fight, flight, or freeze state, or collapse and submit, appease, or shut down. Trauma tends to be very subjective. So what may traumatize one person may not traumatize another. So we have, kind of a breakdown of the triune brain, and this is the rational or thinking part of the brain that I was telling you about before, where the frontal lobe, that rational thinking part, does not fully develop until someone is 25 years old. Okay. All of our reasoning is in there. And then we have the midbrain, or the emotional brain. And inside the emotional brain is something called the amygdala, and that's our danger or fear center. Here we have a reptilian or primitive brain, the oldest part of the brain. And so what happens is, raw information comes along, it's taken in by the oldest part of the brain, the reptilian part of the brain. It's not really analyzed. Whoops. It's not really analyzed. It's just, it may have some safety features, but it's not really analyzed. It's passed on to the emotional part of the brain. If there is danger there, that amygdala is going to start going off. Danger, danger, danger. This is what the nervous system kind of looks like inside you. So you have the sympathetic nerve. It of course, it runs all the way from the brain stem down to the groin area. You see all these tentacles. They're all wrapped around your major organs, heart, lungs, and so on. On this side, we have the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay. Usually, if the brain, that I've got a better picture. Okay, here's a better picture for sharing. So if the amygdala goes off saying there's danger, it's going to start flooding. Usually the sympathetic nervous system with chemicals, hormones, like a lot we don't need to know the name of, but things like cortisol and adrenaline, because it's going to get your body ready to run, ready to fight, freeze, whatever it's going to do. Okay, so it's flooding your system, getting you ready. This is the parasympathetic. It is supposed to do exactly the opposite. If the threat passes or you can negotiate, it's going to calm everything back down, but it can also shut you down if the dorsal vagus nerve on the bottom of that is activated. You can go right into shutdown. So we call this, when this floods your system, we call this a turned on system. So if you could imagine just for a minute that you're walking across your backyard and out of your peripheral, you see a poisonous snake and it's getting ready to strike. Well, your whole body is going to flood with chemicals. It's getting you ready for fight or flight. And then you look again and whew, it's just a garden hose. Well, there's no threat there. So that midbrain is going to communicate with the thinking part of the brain, and the thinking part of the brain is going to say, okay, I've got this story, this narrative. I'm going to tuck it away in long-term memory or wherever I'm going to put it. Everything's okay. But what if that, excuse me, what if that threat doesn't disappear? You've got the information going in to the reptilian brain, passed on to the midbrain. It starts to fire. danger, 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 and your connection to the thinking part of the brain goes offline. You can't access it anymore. You are in raw survival. There is no cognitive thinking. So when people try all the time to reason or rationalize with people who are traumatized or in traumatic reaction, you can't get in that way. You cannot access that because it hasn't gone there. It has not gone through the thinking part of the brain. It's stuck. So what can cause trauma? This isn't a complete list by any stretch of the imagination, but we're looking at a lot of things, medical trauma, all kinds of things, emotional abuse, of course, sexual abuse, um, sexual assault, betrayal of trust, systemic abuse. Systemic abuse is not something that people talk a lot about, that's being victimized at the hands of the system, actually. Witnessing violence, you don't actually have to actually be a part of, you can just witness and you can be traumatized. Pandemics, of course, any sort of psychiatric hospitalization can actually cause trauma. Hospitalization, depending on what happens in you, can cause trauma, violence, and so on. We have a lot of things. Natural disasters of any kind actually can cause trauma. So we have a lot of things that can cause trauma. And what is the impact? Well, again, this is not a complete list, but excuse me, you're looking at a mainstay. There's almost always a loss of sense of safety. That's kind of a mainstay of trauma. People do not feel safe. That's because the nervous system has been set off into fight or flight, and it is scanning for danger. It is hypervigilant and is scanning for danger, and it is looking for safety. You can have reenactment. Hypervigilance is what I just described to you, caused by that loss of sense of safety, overwhelming fear, and so on. Now, here's the interesting thing about trauma. If you experience another trauma down the road, you may experience one and then experience another one down the road. It doesn't have to be the same trauma. It only has to make you feel the same. And that brain is going to go, I know what this is, and it's going to set off a traumatic response. It doesn't even have to be the same to trigger somebody. It only has to make you feel the same. We can have all kinds of things like self-harm, emotional numbing, ADHD-like symptoms, poor emotional control. But the basis of trauma is fear. It's terror. So that system, if that could not go full cycle, if that could not complete its cycle, that system is going to be a turn-on system, and it's going to be scanning for danger, and it's going to be looking for safety. And I think this is all motivated by fear. We can have a lot of symptoms due to traumatic reaction. And again, it doesn't. If you face another trauma later on, it only has to make you feel the same to set someone off. The nervous system doesn't have a time clock. It doesn't know the difference between what happened 20 years ago and what's happening now. It doesn't know the difference. It can't separate out trauma sometimes because it doesn't have a time clock. It only knows this has made me feel the same, and I know what this is. So we have, certain mainstay symptomology of, or what I would call mainstay symptomology. So communities, for example, not only provide, an opportunity to emotionally regulate with others, but they also offer a safe environment for those that live in them. It's where our doctors are, our police, our counselors, our churches, support systems. It's nearly impossible for someone to heal from individual trauma when their community is in shreds or non-existent. So as COVID was a threat to safety, it activated a massive amount of old trauma, some new, particularly in children, but most of it was actually old trauma. And then the one place that should have been there for healing, for feelings of safety, was shredded. The trauma caused by such action was extensive, really extensive. By and large, we had fear-driven communities, with many calling it a trauma tsunami. This is the basis of what you're all seeing. It created mistrust, feelings of betrayal in our systems, fear reactions that override cognitive reasoning and affect family, neighbors, and friends, and some of those are still not repaired. So masking caused a sea of facelessness, identityless people, all the same, with their mouths covered. The visual, a constant reminder of threat to safety, a constant driving it home. So it was also disconcerting to read that in doing experiments with rats, it was discovered that breathing in certain amounts of CO2 actually set off the amygdala, the fear center in the brain. So for children, the isolation, masking, and constant reminders of threat to safety was devastating. So I've treated people who were traumatized as children by the use of ether. That's all they had, for minor surgery back then with ether. And they would cover their eyes with a little pad, mouth, nose, and so on. And oftentimes children would be throwing this off, so they simply, they held them down, to be able to get this done. So, in fact, I believe Peter Levine's very first patient, she was an adult, of course, when the environmental factors came by and kind of took her down, so to speak. But the original trauma was exactly this. It was from that experience. So she was experiencing panic attacks, depression, and more. And it was all because of what she suffered as a young child. So if this from ether, from being held down and so on, could cause this kind of extensive trauma, helplessness, fear in a child, so that by the time she hit adulthood, she was really experiencing a lot of traumatic symptoms. Can you imagine the trauma caused by holding down terrified little ones, inserting a swab up their nose repeatedly? I mean, we were specifically told that children were not in a high risk factor. Many caught common colds and were not allowed back in daycares until they were tested with a swab. Sometimes they were tested 2, 3, 4 times. Held down, screaming, terrified. Isolation had devastating effects on everyone, especially children. When someone is isolated and their support systems are not there, it can also induce the autonomic nervous system to scan for danger because the person's support systems simply aren't there. So now they're alone, they're going to start scanning for danger. So when one knows actually that isolation has been used as a torture technique to elicit extreme psychological distress, we'll kind of get the idea how serious the effects of such a thing is when used on a whole community. Generally, in crisis situations, you'll find it's our boots on the ground trained people who actually take the foreground. Our municipalities, our doctors who are trained for fighting disease, our first report responders, our police, municipal MLA, excuse me, and even neighbors. Everybody kind of pitches in and tries to kind of get the job done. So despite that these people are educated, experienced, they were all shut down as if they were incompetent, in favor of the direction of one government appointed person who between them couldn't possibly have the experience or the investment in their communities. If we consider what the town of Gander did, during 9/11 and how that community actually pulled together to ensure that all the plain people were taken care of in every possible way, one has to wonder if we just would have done a better job. Most relationships are still not healed, and the traumatized just keep pouring in. So it seems that the sense of safety has been so badly shattered that everyone is in a hypervigilant state, just waiting for the other shoe to drop, and almost no one feels safe. In fact, by and large, Canadians, I noticed, are incredibly sad. A lot of trauma has been going on. Then there's maids, and it is astounding that as a generation, we would actually get to a point where we would consider euthanizing not only those that are struggling with depression or some other mental disorder, but children as well. I don't care if they put it on the back burner to discuss it now. They have not taken that off the agenda. We should not even be discussing this. This is where the term mature minor phrase comes in again, but let's call it what it really is, children. I can't quite figure out why we're busy with suicide prevention while vehemently declaring someone's right to take their own life and helping them do it. Before continuing on its subject, I want to first establish that I personally do not believe in mental illness, at least not in the way it is defined or has been sold to us. I believe that the DSM's extensive list of disorders can be explained as trauma symptoms and not diseases within themselves. For example, it's almost impossible to tell the difference between a child diagnosed with ADHD and a traumatized one. Symptoms are pretty much the same. I've seen trauma cause what we would call psychoses caused by trauma. Bipolar, what if that's emotional dysregulation or been misdiagnosed and the person is suffering from emotional dysregulation due to trauma? What we define as learning disabilities or borderline personality disorder has finally been recognized as a dissociative issue due to trauma. Those are just like a few examples. Now, I know that many would disagree with me. I'm aware of that, but I'm not the only one, certainly not the only one to hold this opinion. As far back as the 60s, before the word trauma was widely used, a trauma model approach to mental illness was actually presented and subsequently rejected. So let's assume for now I'm right. Let's just assume I'm right. Excuse me. Roughly 40 to 50% of our youth are incarcerated youth in juvenile detention or reported as having some type of learning disability. In Canada, in our prison system, it's about the same. Although reports vary and statistics can be scarce and hard to find, in the US, it is reported that 75 to 77% have some type of learning disability. In Canada, approximately 1.6 million children have been diagnosed with some type of mental health issue. I think that's low because the stat, of course, is, only the ones that have been reported diagnoses. So less than 20% of those are getting any kind of appropriate care. By age 25, kind of the golden age, by age 25, that number rises to 7.5 million, about 1 in 5 Canadians being diagnosed. Many are diagnosed with some form of anxiety disorder. What's the plan? Are we going to euthanize them all? People who may be suffering from trauma, is that what we're going to do? Start euthanizing them? Because they're maybe suffering trauma doesn't have to be a life sentence. Children whose reasoning and problem-solving brains don't even fully develop until they're on average 25 years old, we're going to euthanize them when they can't, how are we going to justify that? By saying, well, they wanted it. Now, there's some glaring evidence for dropping IQs. Just for some general information, I actually want you to keep in mind, I'm just going to talk about, because I truly do want you to keep this one in mind. It's really, there we go. So you can find a lot of articles about it, truly, but researchers find IQ scores have been dropping since the 1970s. Well, here's the interesting thing about that. One article said no, since the Cold War, regardless, they've been dropping substantially in developed countries. So like a lot. I mean, it's no little thing. You can find a lot of articles about it if you look it up. And of course, each article is going to present, either differing opinions of what they think is causing it. But if you there's a reason why I'm showing you this. If you want to bear with me, you'll connect the dots Trust me, I promise, as we go along. Roughly, I'd say 4,500 people die of suicide every year in this country. That's 12 people a day. In Canada, suicide accounts for 24% of all deaths among 15 to 24-year-olds. I have never witnessed those that have survived the suicide death of a loved one who wasn't traumatized. On average, 7 to 10 people are affected by a suicide death. It's, it's very far-reaching. After we euthanize anyone suffering from a mental health issue, adult or child, are we then planning on euthanizing the entire family for suffering from trauma? Is that what we're planning on doing? There is now sufficient studies actually to show that there's a probable link that antipsychotic medication is being linked to shrinkage of the gray matter in the brain. Now, that doesn't mean that someone on medication should rush right out and stop taking it. That is really dangerous and should not be attempted unless under a medical practitioner's care. However, more and more mental health practitioners have come to the conclusion that the pharmaceutical approach to mental health is unfortunately a colossal failure, with some stating that it actually does more long-term harm than good. Okay, so some sufferers, are only on medication as a means to treat mental health. They're getting nothing else except that. That's it. That's a foreground. Here's a pill. So the success rate in the Western world is somewhere between 10 and 12%. Although those figures can vary a little, I can't imagine why anything is called a success at all if it hasn't cured anybody. That's, a bit of a problem. So for many, multiple drugs are given to counteract side effects or to address symptoms that persist without improving either the quality of life or functionality. Countries that are developing and using less pharmaceuticals and more direct personal approaches of healing, such as the Soteria program and so on, have a much higher success rate, and in some cases it's as much as 65%. So if we're so progressive and we're so successful, someone's going to have to explain that one to me. Psychiatrists have yet to conclusively prove that a single mental illness has a biological or physical cause or a genetic origin. There are no medical tests that can diagnose mental health disorders.